Hi, my name is Nico Heller. Welcome to our 7th Reboot Dialogue. We started Reboot last autumn and last fall with the intention of building dialogues over a longer period of time with committed partners who are working on path-breaking projects, trying to, in a way, turn around many of the world's big problems. We have had a wide range of different contributors so far, ranging from people dealing with educational policy to environmental degradation, specifically climate change and the effects of climate change. And also we had John Bunzl, who started in 2000 a rather unique and interesting organization that aims to support a global collaboration among governments and key stakeholders. The organization he founded is called SIMPOL, Simultaneous Policy, and he is here today to give us an update on how his work with SIMPOL is going, and also to look at, well, the new sort of global business and political environment, the war with Russia, and the implications of that, also in terms of sanctions and so forth, the implications of that for global regulation, climate change, and so forth. So I know I can see that John is in the waiting room already. So let me invite him in and say hello to him. John, I can see your image.
Hi there.
How are you doing? You're still a still image. I think you need to turn your camera on.
Oh, right. Why is my camera not working? Hang on, start video. Oh, here we go.
Ah, we did it. Excellent.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thanks. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm fine.
We have a global, not a global, a stable internet connection today.
Yes, sorry. Yes, that's right.
when we spoke last time, it was stop and go.
Yeah, I don't know. That was just that one day. I think there was a jinx or some nasty spell was cast that day, but anyway, hopefully it's not here today.
Absolutely. John, I said only a very few words about you so far. I mentioned that you've been on this program before, that you are, in that sense, a regular contributor to Reboot 2030, and just give a very basic introduction that you founded SIMPOL in 2000, and that you have since been developing this with many ups and a few downs along the way. And I think because we've had such a difficult ride last time, technically speaking, I think it would be great if we kind of just recap once more before we move on to the topic of the day. Sure. And maybe if you could, in very simple terms, explain what SIMPOL is, you know, how the idea came about, and what its purpose is, what it is here to do.
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, let me just say that the war in Ukraine has changed a lot of things, and I'll maybe come back to that in more detail later, Nico. But in principle, what SIMPOL, it's short for the simultaneous policy, is a campaign to get nations around the world to cooperate on solving the global problems that no nation can tackle alone. So things like climate change, fair corporate taxation, internet regulation, sorting out space junk, you know, and the problem with almost all of these problems is that any nation that would move first or would act alone would actually harm itself. Okay, so any nation really sort of dramatically reducing its carbon emissions would hamper its economy, and that would give it a disadvantage compared to other nations. So it's not just that nations can't tackle these problems alone. There is actually a disincentive to any nation to move first, okay? And that's why we need simultaneous implementation, simultaneous action, because if we can get all nations to act together, nobody loses out, everybody wins. So that's
I think there's a really interesting difference we made, because of course when people talk about efficient markets, they talk exactly about the opposite, don't they? They talk about somebody gaining an advantage by doing something first, and then somebody else is kind of trying to top that, and you get a virtuous cycle of, you know, virtuous competition. Here you encounter a cost as a first mover.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you see, markets are great for first mover advantage, right? That's what markets do. I'm a businessman. I know that's what they're great for.
That's right.
But where markets are no good is when we're talking about problems where there's a first mover disadvantage, and in particular it relates to governments, because in a globalized economy where all governments are sort of competing for investment and jobs and so forth, no government wants to harm its economy. But very often the kind of problems we need to solve would harm a national economy if the government were to act alone. So what really SIMPOL is all about is how to make action on global problems in every nation's self-interest.
And you have given this form of competition, you have given that a name. You're talking about destructive global competition, don't you?
DGC, destructive global competition. So it's like a vicious circle. And, you know, we've seen this, there's so many examples of this, not just climate change. I mean, destructive global competition has sort of two variants, I would say. One is what I call race to the bottom. So you see one government undercutting another, you know, them all undercutting each other. That, for example, is very, very obvious in levels of corporation tax, where one country cuts, then the competitor cuts, and before you know it, corporation tax, you know, Amazon, Apple, these people are paying almost no tax.
Well, in fact, before you know it, governments start paying companies to come to their country.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy. And then, but the other, I think probably more important and more insidious variant is what I call regulatory chill. Okay, so this would apply, for example, to climate change, where it's not that governments are undercutting or loosening regulation, they may be increasing them, but only very, very glacially slow, because, you know, if they go too far, they would get a serious competitive disadvantage. Just these little incremental steps is what I call regulatory chill. It means they're kind of frozen into these very tiny moves, which really are completely inadequate, because the problem is like racing away down the fast lane, but governments are kind of only crawling along the slow lane.
That's right.
And hence the crisis. So simultaneous action is the #1 headline key. However, there are other aspects to SIMPOL. Second is that unlike the United Nations, what we are proposing is a multi-issue agreement. Okay, the problem with the United Nations negotiations on climate change, for example, Nico, is that we're dealing with just one single issue, which is carbon emissions. And the problem with almost any single issue is that you will always have some nations that win, others that lose, and of course the losers have no incentive to cooperate. So nothing really happens. Right? This is Paris Climate Agreement 101. We see it. And it's not just the United States that didn't join, it actually goes for every country who's even in, you know, they may be in the agreement, but because of destructive global competition, they're still moving glacially slow. So a multi-issue agreement would mean, for example, matching or pairing a climate agreement, for example, with maybe a global wealth tax or a global currency transactions tax, so that the proceeds that we gain from the tax can be used to compensate the big loser, the losing nations, on the climate part of the agreement. Okay,
I mean, this notion of compensation or of reward is actually a notion that comes up in a number of Reboot talks now. In fact, we have two others on climate. One we had last week, the first one, where we're talking about a climate or a carbon dividend, and the idea there was that if you have if you put a price on carbon, either through tax or through any other kind of mechanism, then of course that hurts those who use carbon a lot, relative to their overall expenditure most. So for example, if I'm a single mother, but I have to use my car to drive, to get to my cleaning job, the petrol I pay is disproportionate amount of my budget, and the carbon component is a big. But if I would get a carbon dividend, in other words, if much of that tax on carbon would be redistributed, then I would have an incentive, and I could say, as a sort of a low-income person, okay, I'm going to use public transport now, and I pocket the carbon dividend. So I might walk away with an extra €1,000 a year.
The problem, Nico, though, is that in principle that's fine, but it presumes that the government can take from industry and give to single mothers who have a cleaning job, right? The problem is that no government wants to do that, because taking from their industry or taxing their industry will cause their industries to be uncompetitive with industries elsewhere. So again, you still have the problem of destructive global competition.
That's right.
And you see, this is really what SIMPOL is about, is that globally, what we face today is a mismatch between a globalized economy, which is all interconnected, but governance, which is in 200 odd different separate boxes, different countries. And that mismatch between a global economy and just national governance means that anything that's global, whether it's global corporations or climate change, which is sort of moving globally, if you like, the carbon emission, they can outmaneuver nations. So what SIMPOL is about is giving us a new level of politics to actually address these issues. It's like right now we have our hands behind our back. We see all these global problems, but we have no tool to act on them with. SIMPOL is potentially that tool.
That's right. So this idea of having a basket of issues that are being negotiated simultaneously essentially creates an environment where there's a bargaining opportunity.
Exactly.
You can trade one's benefits against somebody else's costs, and in so doing, you level the playing field.
Exactly. And in that way, the whole idea is to make immediate substantive action in every nation's self-interest. Okay, so simultaneous action, multi-issue policy negotiations. And the third point about SIMPOL, which is also completely that no other organization is doing this, is we are harnessing the votes of citizens. So in order to drive politicians towards this target. So when citizens sign up to SIMPOL, which is of course completely free of charge, what they're doing is they are pledging to give strong voting preference to politicians or parties who have signed a pledge to implement or negotiate and implement the simultaneous policy. And in that way, politicians that sign up gain an electoral advantage over those who fail to sign up. Okay, and because of that, we've actually been able to get over 100 members of parliament in the UK who come from all across the party political spectrum to sign the pledge. We have now also 40 in Germany. We've got about 15 in Ireland, 4 or 5 in Australia. So it's beginning to move. So the important thing about this is that citizens can actually affect this, that citizens can actually influence this. We can actually use our votes in a way to drive politicians towards the cooperation we need. So those are kind of the 3 planks of SIMPOL.
That's right. So maybe explain at what stage you are in the development of SIMPOL. So these are the three, the three, if you like, factors that make SIMPOL a successful sort of campaigning or sort of
potentially. Yes, potentially.
Yeah. So potentially, that's right. But of course, there's a lot of ifs and buts.
Yes, there's lots of ifs and buts. I mean, the phase we're in now is really getting people to understand SIMPOL, first of all, to understand the need for global cooperation. Most people don't get it because most people don't really understand the way the global economy works. Most of the global justice movement, Extinction Rebellion, all these people, they don't understand the way the global economy works. They generally think that if we just protest loud enough and long enough, the government will do what we ask. But what SIMPOL explains is that is that governments can't do it, not on their own. So this idea of national civil disobedience just it cannot work in a globalized environment. You've got to have coordinated global action. And that's what SIMPOL offers. But because they don't really understand that, that's why SIMPOL is growing so slowly, because most people still view the world through national glasses. To understand SIMPOL, you've got to put on your global glasses. Right.
I think there are a lot of areas where you could debate whether there is not another solution, especially in the current political environment where people are closing off. So I think there is a kind of on the populist right, there's an argument for sort of a nationalist economics. So, let's pull up borders and, America first, or whatever the slogan might be, which in essentially kind of is sort of an anti-globalization movement that has a lot of support actually on both sides of the political spectrum. But at the moment, it seems to be the right that is pulling the strings.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I'm glad you brought that up, Nico, because that's exactly where SIMPOL kind of straddles both sides, because SIMPOL is not globalist. It's also not only nationalist. It's simultaneous, all nations simultaneously. So it actually speaks to it strengthens nationalism through global cooperation.
Yeah, absolutely. But you have to get your head around this, don't you?
Yeah, you have to get your head around it. And that's the problem, is most people are either or thinkers.
That's right.
Either global or it's national. SIMPOL is about both.
That's right. And there's also
people are not both and thinkers yet.
And there's another tendency, and that is of course the complexity of pulling together a SIMPOL consortium or a simple solution around a specific policy issue is quite an art form, I believe. I mean, there's a lot of
it is, Nico, and I'm not pretending that it would be easy. It won't. It will be incredibly complex. There's no doubt about it. However, what SIMPOL is really doing right now is educating people, getting citizens and politicians to sign up in principle to this. And then, if we can get far enough, then we can start bringing in the expertise needed to try to deal with these complexities of policy.
That's right.
And the other thing on that, I think, is important to say is that SIMPOL is not about all nations doing the same thing at the same time. It's actually about just coordinating, because what is agreed under SIMPOL will be different for different nations. There'll be a certain amount of uniformity, but there'll also be a lot of difference. But the point is that if all nations act together in a coordinated fashion, that's when we can get the win-win out.
And there, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, there would be sort of, if you like, an outcome or output focus. So, different nations, different countries might pursue different policy goals, but with the same overall end game in mind. So,
I think the point is that right, to give you an example, right now the UN negotiations, for example, on climate, they're all about targets. They agree a target, but the problem is that no nation knows what every other nation will do to actually achieve that target. And they don't therefore know how those actions, if they were taken, would impact on their competitiveness, on their economies and so forth. So what's the result? Nobody does anything or very little. So the point about SIMPOL is transparency. So if every nation knows and has negotiated and pre-agreed what each nation will actually do, how they will maybe each be compensated by the global tax that we have on the side, then you are building transparency, you're building trust and confidence, because only with that will you get the action. So it's a hugely tall order, but what choice do we have?
No, that's right. I mean, there's, this is the thing. It's like there's sort of, people like to, just basically ignore problems that they can't solve. I know this from my consulting days as a management consultant. You were told it was a total taboo to bring up a problem where you didn't have a solution for. Consultancy is not about solving all problems. It's about selling solutions.
Right.
So and there is that real problem. So, and it's a similar thing in politics. You really don't want to set yourself up on a platform with a bunch of problems that you can't solve.
No. Absolutely right, Nico. And it's actually, that psychological problem, if you like, is a really big issue, because what it leads politicians to do is it leads them to lie to themselves. It leads them to say that somehow economic competitiveness and environmental sustainability are not opposing. They can somehow be done together. Bullshit. They can't. But they can't admit that, because then they would have a problem they can't solve.
Yeah, that's right.
But what SIMPOL is saying, well, actually, there is a way that we can solve this. And, I think that's partly why we've done so, even though support for SIMPOL from citizens has been relatively weak, Nico, from politicians, it's actually been relatively quite good. And I think the reason for that is that politicians are the ones who are most directly on the horns of this dilemma. We've got to keep the country competitive, but we also want to save the planet. How do we resolve this dilemma? SIMPOL can, in principle, do it, and that's why they're supporting it. Many politicians have written to us saying this is a great idea. So they're almost relieved that there's something out there that resolves this very basic dilemma.
So,
but what we really need is for citizens. Without the citizens getting behind it, we just won't have sufficient credibility to really make the big strides to get nations on board. And if we can't get democratic countries on board, there's no chance at all to get non-democratic countries.
Well, you see, this is an interesting point. I have a sort of reboot dialogue later on in the season with someone who will talk about what is sort of tentatively called sort of a D10. And the D10 is essentially a bit like a G7 or a G20, is the idea that you bring together the leading democracies of this world. But unlike the G7 or the G20, you exclude the kind of autocracies. So no China, no Russia. But of course, that way, you could sort of say that you're preaching to the converted, and there's an aspect to that, but you also stop undermining democracy. You stop watering down democracy, because you're pulling all on the same strings. But the thing is when you look at the kind of the basket of countries that would come together, they would control nearly 80% of global GDP. So by, so you're still talking a massive economic force on the democracy side of nations. At this point, we don't know how this whole field is going to shift over time.
No, I mean, I think, certainly SIMPOL could be applied to a D10. The same principles could be applied. However, originally it was really more designed for any nation. And again, that is why simultaneous action is flexible, because it can include democratic and non-democratic.
Of course, but I mean, I guess what I'm absolutely, but I guess what I'm saying is that you might be able to build more momentum quicker, and you wouldn't have to be exclusive, because of course, with one set of policy issues, you might attract more the democratic nations. With other policy issues, you might attract sort of emerging markets or like developing countries, because there's other issues that are probably closer to home to them. And so you might have different clusters of sort of economic alliances where people come together as a simple community to solve a specific set of issues. So they could be couldn't they?
I'd be delighted, to be in touch with the D10. I haven't heard of them actually, Nico. So I'd be delighted if they, maybe there's something we can learn from each other or help each other with.
I mean, Joe Biden is very keen on this D10 idea, and so there's a lot of work. I mean, you had this kind of global democracy conference last December, and received a lot of kind of criticism because it was democracies as opposed to everybody. So Biden is pushing this very hard, trying to rebuild global democracy after Trump. And there's a lot of push and a lot of kind of goodwill going into that from certainly the UK is very, very strongly involved in this than the US, Australia.
Okay.
And the other thing about the D10, of course, is it would include countries like Australia, like South Korea, like India, that are currently not represented either in the G7 or the G20. So that would be an interesting new kind of way of looking at framing sort of global foreign relations. The whole playing field has changed in the last 3 months.
Yes.
And this is the thing, when you have like a project like SIMPOL, which has sort of a 10-year time horizon, that clearly, it's a bit like sailing across the Atlantic. You don't know what weather you're going to get halfway through. And it's a bit like that here as well. On your sort of best guess, what's the sort of the immediate impact of this kind of new kind of world order that is sort of shaping up with China cozying up with, Russia and all of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, when you see what's happened in the last couple of months, talking about global cooperation, as SIMPOL sounds completely crazy, sounds completely irrelevant and ridiculous. However, I think if we leave aside, if we can, the human horrors of and just the awfulness of this conflict, let's look at the effects. The effects are going to harm everybody. We are going to have the sanctions on Russia are going to harm Russian people. The higher costs, energy costs, food costs are going to harm the rest of the world. The sort of deglobalization is going to harm China.
And there's no winners. There's no winners.
Sorry?
There's no winners.
There's no winners. And so in a sense, the terrible global effects of all of this could mean that something like SIMPOL is all the more necessary, because to get rid of all of that horrific effects and to start working together again in a way that everybody wins, you need a framework.
Yeah, no, totally.
It could be that framework. So in a paradoxical sense, I think that what is happening now could be a prelude potentially to something like SIMPOL or the D10 or something, but maybe an expanded version or something like that. So yeah, I mean, right now it's hard to think about that, but
I mean, what seems to be happening is that, and is that you do get a sort of a polarization in the way we haven't seen really since the end of the Cold War. And people talk about a new Cold War, and with that obviously comes a new Iron Curtain. I mean, of course, the role of Germany in this is quite an interesting and actually quite a sort of shameful one, I have to say, from a sort of an international perspective. I'm not proud at all of what our Chancellor is kind of doing here. But that's that's what we're sort of seeing. We're sort of seeing a sort of like quite a determined US, quite a determined UK, a sort of most of the time determined France, and a very indeterminate Germany on the one side, and of course Germany will have to pick the West because that's where its markets, that's where its future lies. I mean, it's kind of increasingly isolated globally, and it'll have to essentially, it has to choose sides at some point. It can't. In fact, it's going to be interesting to see whether Olaf Scholz is going to survive this as a chancellor. It's interesting. But there's a kind of a real tearing apart going on, and Germany is really at the center of this, and it's feeling this kind of sort of gravitational forces very, very strongly, and it's kind of tearing apart the sort of the post 1990 consensus, European consensus. I don't mean European Union, I mean as in the kind of the continent of Europe consensus. And that consensus has essentially fallen apart. We don't know what is following. What we do know is we probably need new structures, new alliances, and of course this whole idea of like D10 and so is kind of heading that way. That basically saying, well, we have to reconstitute like the West, essentially, to protect democracy, liberal democracy in particular, and our way of life. And so this is happening, and it's I think very hard for anybody at the moment to sort of, it's everybody's best guess how this is going to work out. And I think people are this creates a lot of insecurity at all levels. I mean, in terms of investment, in terms of, kind of political alliances, and of course also consumers. I mean, consumers are becoming increasingly sort of insecure about their spending. And so I think we're all heading headlong towards a recession in the summer.
Absolutely.
And it's not just prices, it's also kind of psychology. It's just when they unsettled. So the idea of a SIMPOL, as you said, is an attractive proposition. But the question is where do you pack it onto? What is how are you going to take it through this really volatile period?
Well, I think we just need to keep explaining it as I'm doing today with you, Nico. I think that it's like many things in life. We only grow up and cooperate when the water's up to here, right? I think sadly we will have this global recession. It will maybe last for a very, very long time, just like the first Cold War. I think that, but eventually, like with the first Cold War, there will have to be a thawing at some point. And I hope that by that point, SIMPOL is a lot further along the line than it is now. But when that will be, it's anybody's guess, of course.
I mean, if there was a watchtower between the new East and the new West, that's where you would like SIMPOL to be, wouldn't you? You would like it to be really, you wouldn't want it to be solidly grounded in the West nor in the East, but you would want it to kind of, in a way, bridge those worlds.
Yes, yeah, well, that's right, and that's really what we try to be, because I think when the whole world is polarizing, it's important that at least some few people are that's not to say that we condone what Russia is doing or that we condone China or anything like that. We are purely saying here is a framework for pragmatic global cooperation. We don't have any particular, we have no comment, if you like, as SIMPOL. I mean, I have my own personal views on things like anybody else, but as SIMPOL, we are about the future, not about the present or the past.
How just to kind of to understand this better. You say you have different kind of support groups in different countries. How does this work, and how do you coordinate? And do you organize conferences where you kind of meet up, say every so often, to kind of exchange views and update each other? How do you actually work?
Well, basically what we have is we have a sort of core management group, which consists of national coordinators who are volunteers in each country who are very generously giving their time to developing SIMPOL in their countries. And it's their job to recruit new citizen supporters in their country, new politicians and candidates, and to seek the support of NGOs and others in their country. And of course, we meet regularly. We meet about every 3 weeks on Zoom. And then hopefully also depending on how things are developing in each country, the citizens can also have their own discussions and groups. It's very informal at the moment, but we are, and it is difficult, I think, to keep a long-term goal campaign like SIMPOL.
Very difficult.
To keep it vibrant and keep people interested. So that there is that aspect. But I think, what we're really trying to do is to, if you like, it's almost a little bit like providing a lifeboat. Nobody's interested in the lifeboat until suddenly the day they need it, And so it's a little bit that kind of game for us, which is tough. But we feel we feel that we do have something. I mean, to my knowledge, and I've been at this for 20 years, SIMPOL is the only campaign that actually has some kind of framework for a solution, but importantly can actually engage citizens' votes in a very powerful way to drive politicians to sign up to this.
So, I mean, in my kind of sort of mind, sort of thinking quantitatively about this, I'm sort of thinking, well, I mean, as you said, it's incredibly difficult to keep a sort of a momentum going. And in fact, this is not just the problem with SIMPOL, that's the problem with every kind of climate change campaign. You know, they kind of come up, they have their short life, and then the next one, but there's no continuity, and there's no, and so as a result of it, of course, you know, with these campaigns coming and going, very little learning is transferred from one campaign to the next. Everybody's reinventing the wheel and essentially going through the same motions over and over and over again. So campaigns, and this is partially also, of course, the idea of Reboot, to engage with people like you who have this long-term vision and have the stamina and the kind of steadfastness to actually to go the extra mile, and but how, I mean, in my thinking, what would help me tremendously is if I had some kind of notion of trigger points. So if I would know, well, you know, the sort of critical mass kind of thing. So if I would know that, you know, if we get say, I'm making this up just to kind of explain the idea. If we get like 2/3 of European Parliament members to sign up to this, we can essentially kind of push for a first SIMPOL within a European context. Or if we can, or you have Asian kind of like, you know, like the Asian kind of economic zone, or the, you know, and you have like in the Americas, you have economic, well, you could basically have regional SIMPOLs, which might be easier to pull together and have the very same issues. I mean, there's a lot of stuff.
Well, yeah, and the thing, yes, I mean, I understand that kind of linear idea, Nico, but this is the problem. We already live in a globalized world. Nothing less than global cooperation ultimately will suffice. It's like this is partly why you see such problems in the European Union. You know, the European Union, in a sense, is intended as a kind of transnational bulwark against sort of global forces, but even the European Union is being picked apart.
Oh, but at the European level, you can actually, I'll give you an example. I mean, for instance, take a carbon tax as a way of kind of making pollution more expensive. And then you have the carbon trading schemes, both at the European, but also at the global level. You have different. So take the carbon tax. So if the EU would say, we want to bring in a carbon tax, then the first instinct would be to say, well, how can they do this? Because of course, if China doesn't participate, or the US, or, you know, other countries outside or the UK now, then obviously the European companies become non-competitive. Well, that is not entirely true, according to the people who are working on this, because you can have a mechanism, economic, like for instance tariffs. So that
so they're talking about it's called border adjustment.
That's right.
Exactly. Now that is one example, Nico. Yes, where you could kind of force a reciprocity from other parts of the world, and you know, I'm keeping my eye on that, and that's potentially another way to solve the problem. So
because I think the same would go for a Tobin tax, of all kinds of arrangements where the global argument weighs very strongly, but if you had like a concerted kind of agreement and effort.
So if the EU and the United States agreed to do it, the others would sort of be forced to follow. Yeah, that's also possible. That's also possible. And you know, if that happens, terrific. You know, I'd be only too pleased to hang up my boots and
no, this would be a great start, wouldn't it? Because you'd be dealing with a few players, and you know, and possibly I don't know, it would be a different game than having to bring in very like, you know, poor countries on the one hand and highly industrialized countries on the other, and their interests diverge so much that it may be very difficult to ever bring them on the same.
Yeah, well, that, you know, I think, I mean, I would certainly, you know, in terms of border adjustment taxes or things like that, you know, I think we should certainly, I think it's really good. It needs to be tried. It needs to be given full support. And let's see, you know, so on some issues it might work, on some issues it might not. I don't know, but I certainly think it's a more promising approach. It's certainly the one to try first, and if it doesn't work, or if there are still shortcomings, perhaps something like SIMPOL might, in the end, you know, be required. But I would say to people, support both. You know,
yeah. Oh, yeah. No. It's absolutely. It's not one or the other. The question is
exactly,
just.
yeah.
That's right. I
Yeah.
mean, absolutely. I mean, this is a beautiful scheme for a global thing. No question. That's where it's headed. But there may have to be some interim steps. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, that's right. And I think certainly, you know, I hope that they will do this border adjustment thing just so that we can see whether it works or not. Because if it does, then we can pile more effort and attention into that. And with any luck, something like SIMPOL won't be needed at all.
Well, or SIMPOL might actually smooth the way, because you still have to get agreement, like even at a European level, because or once you have, like, say, the US and Europe, or you have whatever, like a D10, for example, where there is no no institution that would bind them together.
But I think also certainly the sort of voting process that SIMPOL is using could be used to provide citizen input into these, and to add citizen voting pressure to nations to agree these international.
Give us an example, just to kind of make this more interesting. Give us an example of how, in your mind, this would work in practice. How would citizens, like, take any example and just say, so give us an example of how citizens could actually interface with a kind of a global policy making process?
Okay, well, on our website, there's a download that you can download called the information pack, and there's more details in there. But basically what we envisage is that basically in democratic countries, citizens who support SIMPOL would, in the first instance, through a process, a policy development process, would in the first instance identify the top 10 global issues from their particular national perspective. And of course, that will differ in different countries. And also to develop potential solutions for those top 10 issues. So there would be, in the first instance, a national level or national stage of policy development. And then at a certain point, when you've got enough governments and nations on board, you would then have a global negotiation where there would be a kind of cross-linking of all of those, of sorting out what are the two top issues that everyone can agree on. And then maybe you will get the first simultaneous policy coming from that.
There's an interesting question that's just popping up, but I think this may well be the topic for our next conversation. AI, artificial intelligence. I mean, like, to what extent could AI aid or automate some of that?
Yes.
And I think that's an interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we would love to involve. I think that this is exactly. During that process of negotiation, it needs to be supported by AI type information. So if our nation does this, what will be the policy effect on us and also on all the other countries, so that everyone can actually have an idea of what their decisions are likely to result in. And I think that kind of information support is absolutely vital. And I think that's where AI and computer modeling generally could have a tremendously powerful input into SIMPOL. Because again, it would increase the transparency. Because if all the governments know what the effect is going to be on each other and on themselves, you then have the much more solid basis for action. Right now, nobody kind of really knows what the effect might be, and of course politicians don't want to do anything that would they're very risk averse. And so,
but of course, if you have like 180 countries, all essentially kind of inputting their kind of range of policy options around a kind of a framework, you're talking like serious complexity and like a lot of sort of potentially sort of unintended consequences, because if this of course AI in a way could take out a lot of that complexity and could generate lightning fast answers to a lot of kind of what if questions. And you could
I think one would obviously try to simplify it, and you would have to during that international negotiation, there would be a process of weeding out those issues that are the most complex, and trying to start with something relatively simple, but that is also urgent. I mean, it could be a climate agreement and a Tobin tax or a global wealth tax or something like that. I don't know, but I'm not a policy expert. But I think it's we're not talking about a negotiation that deals with all issues in one go. That would be crazy. We're talking about SIMPOL 1, SIMPOL 2, SIMPOL 3, SIMPOL 4, year 1, year 3, year 5. So there would be a kind of rolling process with opportunities at each implementation to revise the previous ones. So there's a kind of
iterations.
Yeah, so there's a continuous improvement process. And I think that, that to my mind is the kind of governance model that we need. It can include non-democratic, it doesn't insist on democracy, much as we would like it. It is flexible enough to include non-democratic and democratic countries. So I think ultimately we're going to need something like this, I think,
Absolutely. So, John, could you just in a couple of sentences sort of summarize once more what SIMPOL is, what it does, how it reduces or sort of somehow counters destructive global competition, and what the three most important things are that need to fall into place for this to move forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the first instance, SIMPOL is about how to get nations to cooperate by making cooperation in their own by structuring it so that cooperation is in each nation's self-interest, immediate self-interest. And the three planks of that, to my mind, are: one is simultaneous implementation, two is multi-issue policy negotiations so that you have win-win trade-offs, and number three is citizens using their votes in the way that SIMPOL offers to actually incentivize politicians and governments towards that cooperative global end. That's basically it in a nutshell.
And what are the sort of the drivers of this? What's going to make this possible over the next 5 to 10 years? What's going
to make it possible is the absence of global cooperation. But because we have an absence of global cooperation, we already have dramatic wealth inequality. We already have pandemics that we can't deal with terribly effectively because we don't have proper coordination. So what will drive SIMPOL or something like it is just things getting worse, because you cannot have a globalized economy with only national governance. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
and so I think it's the crisis the growing crises that will drive us to, and you're already beginning to see it, Nico. The government, about 140 governments agreed a minimum level of corporation tax about a year ago or 6 months ago. I mean, it was an agreement that was heavily skewed in favor of the rich countries. But nevertheless, I think post-COVID, with all governments sort of up to their necks in debt, there was the pressure to cooperate to raise revenues, and that's what I mean. Every crisis is an opportunity, or necessity is the mother of invention, you could say. So I think what SIMPOL is really saying is when we finally wake up with the water right around our necks, here on a silver platter is a framework that can actually resolve these issues, that gives us a framework for dealing cooperatively with these global issues that right now no nation, not even the most powerful countries, can deal with alone.
Absolutely. So, of course, how do you, as you move forward, I mean, do you give yourself any kind of targets, or do you have any plans, or do you just take it a step, like a day at a time?
Our main focus, apart from sort of trying to recruit citizens, is recruiting politicians. So every time there's an election, we will campaign at the election to get politicians and candidates to sign the SIMPOL pledge. Again, that pledge basically says, I as a politician will implement the simultaneous policy if elected to Parliament, subject to the policy content of SIMPOL being agreed and subject to sufficient other nations also signing up to it. So it's very much a pledge in principle. But we are using elections as the main sort of
Did you have any success at the recent French election?
We didn't campaign in the presidential election because we're really only starting in France. So we're going to start with the legislative elections coming up next month.
Okay.
But that'll be our very first one. So
in France, yeah.
Yeah. So yes, we certainly will be campaigning. We campaigned in the German election, the recent one, and we increased the number of pledged MDBs, pledged Bundesräte from. I think we had 16 and we now have 40, you know. So that's what we're using to try to drive the campaign forward by partly getting politicians signed up, but also showing citizens that it can be done.
Yeah.
You know, and that their vote matters. You know, I mean, in some circumstances, in one or two occasions, when a citizen has signed up, we forward their sign up to their local member of parliament, and in some cases that member of parliament has signed up just on the basis of that one person. Because I think, you know, SIMPOL, on the one hand, SIMPOL brings the politicians and political parties into competition with each other, but on the other, it also kind of makes common sense, and I think that common sense appeal is very, you know, that's partly why I think we have support from, mostly from the left, I would say, but we also have support from conservative politicians as well, who recognize that some kind of global cooperation is basically, it's a no-brainer.
I mean, to me, and I would sort of describe myself as a centrist, really. And I think from a sort of a centrist perspective, it's a very attractive proposition because, as you said, it's neither left nor right, but it's kind of, and it is potentially democratic. I mean, as you said, there is there's this link into, so it's a tool. It's a tool that, you know, politicians can use to overcome the refusal to cooperate. And that's, I think that is a really important tool for politicians and of course for citizens to have. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. So looking forward to the next, to another interview in sort of 6 to 12 months time. Whilst we were talking, this idea of artificial intelligence, I thought it was quite interesting. I was wondering if I would find an expert on artificial intelligence. I have someone in mind. I don't want to kind of blare it out now because he may say no. So, you know, so I have to treat carefully. But I have somebody in mind who's quite high up in Google, working for the kind of like, he's one of the sort of the top guys there, working in artificial intelligence and one of their top experts. I was wondering if we would have a threesome next time, and if he had a little bit of preparation to kind of engage with you prior to the dialogue, so that he really understands what this is about, and that you understand a little bit more the scope of what he might be able to bring to the debate.
That would be wonderful.
Wouldn't that be an interesting?
Yeah, I'd love that, Nico. I really would. You know, I think that would be marvelous. I mean, you know, one of the other things that we would love to do, and that potentially he could be interested in that direction, is we want to get a university study arranged on the feasibility of combining say a climate and a Tobin tax, and you know what reductions in emissions are required by what date. How much will that cost? How high does the tax therefore need to be? What would potential distributions of the revenue scenario, what different scenarios might be envisaged for distributing the revenue? How could that be modeled? You know, so you know, yes, I mean, I would love to have a discussion like that. Yeah.
So I think we could. I think that would be an interesting thing to do. Of course, we would have to in interim. We'd have to kind of obviously organize this and have a few chats about to make it work. Because a three-way discussion is always more complex than just a straightforward dialogue. But I think this would be an interesting thing to do, to sort of see what artificial intelligence can bring to this. I think another thing at another point interesting might be to get somebody like a sort of a top level consultant on elections, just sort of target from electoral kind of point of view, how it could be used as a campaigning tool in elections. And so I think we could, moving forward, kind of look at SIMPOL with you very much at the center of this from various kind of different perspectives and see how we can create awareness around it in that way.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the company Cambridge Analytica comes to mind, but I mean, if we could use that kind of know-how, that kind of computer know-how to recruit more citizens to SIMPOL, which as you say is neither right nor left, it kind of spans both. Then I think that's the kind of help it really needs. Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, what you there sort of looking for is possibly like Facebook or Google or one of these guys, or Twitter, as a sponsor or as a sort of an ally to work with.
Yes.
And I think they all have foundations where they would kind of support, certain projects on certain conditions. But I think that's something to explore, kind of moving forward.
Yes, definitely. I mean, there's certainly potential for that. Even though I suppose it might require a simultaneous policy in order to regulate social media platforms globally, but
well, with Elon Musk kind of like taking on Twitter, they may, it's going to be very interesting to see how that, how that's going to. He may actually not be able to do it, depending on how the whole Tesla shares, how they develop.
Yeah, but it's interesting though, because as you say, because in a sense, it's sort of like these global platforms like Twitter and Facebook are essentially, they have the character of public utilities. However, they are privately owned.
Yeah.
And again, that dilemma is probably one that can only be solved through some kind of global, essentially democratic oversight.
I think there may well. I mean, obviously, the European Union has heavily curtailed, Google and Facebook and Twitter already. There's a lot more regulation, of course, within the European Union than there is across the pond in the US. And there may well at some point be sort of a kind of this would make sense to somehow try to harmonize this globally again. I find it quite frustrating to sort of like, when you're traveling and you've got different levels of access, depending where you are, whether you are, and your timeline looks very different if you're like in Europe or if you're in the US.
Yes, that's right.
So yes, absolutely. I think that's there's be interesting to see whether like SIMPOL can be used in a private sector context like that. For things like social media regulation. That'd be an interesting thing to look into as well. John, this has been a really interesting conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for bringing me up to date.
Yes, it's always good fun to talk to you, Nico. Thank you.
Thank you. So I hope you're going to have a peaceful and relaxed summer. I think Corona is going to be with us for some time, and we have to find ways of ignoring it or living with it or whatever, but somehow return to a kind of a way that is sustainable.
Yes.
Also for businesses and also for the cultural sector and all the rest. It's been a difficult.
Well, I think it's more the war in Ukraine, the effects of that we're going to be dealing with even more than coronavirus going forward.
I think it's all in the cocktail, isn't it? I mean, this is just a cocktail that keeps getting better and better. Didn't we think that after Corona it's all going to be hopefully back to some and there we have it. War in Ukraine, and who knows what comes next.
Yes, who knows? Anyway, great talking to you, Nico. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, and we'll stay in touch and hopefully kind of schedule a kind of a further dialogue further down the line.
Would love to, and let's stay in touch about your friend at Google.
Absolutely, I will check that out, definitely.
Okay, lovely.
Talk soon. Cheers. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.